Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ramaya Campbell. I am from the USC Student Interfaith Council. We want to welcome you to our afternoon session, The Conceptual Creation of Sacred Clothing in the Bible and the Ancient World. Our speakers will be John Thompson from the Institute of Religion for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Selena Billington, an independent scholar, Jacob Riddicker from the John A. Widtsoe Foundation, the Very Reverend Father John Bacchus from the Greek Orthodox community will respond to these presentations, after which we will have a 15-minute panel discussion moderated by Daniel Gertner from the Southern Baptist Seminary. This will be followed by a 10-minute question and answer session with you, the audience. For more information on each of our participants, please see your program book. And for that question and answer session, we will be giving out cards for you to write down your question on. Now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Good afternoon. So the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts are some of the earliest extant religious texts in known history. These texts are carved on the stone walls of the burial chambers, antechambers, and corridors located inside the 5th and 6th dynasty royal pyramids, dating from 2350 to 2100 BCE. And the pyramid texts are the canonical foundations for the coffin text and Book of the Dead corpora of later eras in Egyptian history, and continue in use until the very end of the Pharaonic civilization, roughly 2.5 millennia later. Their importance to the religious culture of ancient Egypt throughout its existence cannot be underestimated. Contemporary to and even preceding the advent of the royal pyramid texts are the texts and images found on the above-ground chapels of the non-royal tombs near the pyramids, with the earliest extant examples dating as far back as 2600 BC. In a previous study, I demonstrated that when you take all the priests appearing in the offering table scenes of these non-royal tomb chapels, such as here and here and here, and then combine them together, the resulting sequence of displayed actions matches the sequence and descriptions of the offering list rites in the pyramid texts, suggesting that at least some of the pyramid texts existed and were in use long before their first appearance in the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty. Further, it suggests that the pyramid texts were being used for both royal and non-royal alike from the earliest times. A term that often appears in relation to the actions of these priests is the word sah, in various grammatical forms. The S is a causative, and the root meaning of akh is believed to mean to blaze or to be radiant, like a flame or the sun. Hence, the term akhet means, or is translated horizon, literally the place of radiating. Consequently, sah can be translated as cause to blaze or radiate. Some scholars suggest it means cause to be effective or useful. It can also mean cause salvation, as Jan Osman suggested down here. In applying a concept like salvation or path of salvation to Egypt, we must orient ourselves primarily to this idea of heavenly radiance. The idea here is that the ancient Egyptians appeared to believe that the rites performed in this sequence causes one to be radiant or glorified. The ritual sequence in both the royal and pyramid texts, both the royal pyramid texts and the non-royal elite tombs is, as you see here on the slide. It begins with a libation, followed by a censing, and then a natron washing and a meal that's typically associated or referred to as the opening of the mouth. An anointing, a clothing, and then another censing, and then another natron washing and meal, another clothing, and then bringing the foot is actually kind of a ritual of sweeping, as it were, your footprints with a broom. And reversion of offerings is when you take the offerings of the meal out of the tomb or the temple and distribute it among the people. Followed by an execration, which is usually redware that's smashed, a natron washing, another libation, a final censing, and a sealing. In temple and religious tradition generally, censing can be understood as a liminal or transitional rite, allowing one to move from one status or station to another, such as ascending from a lower to a higher order. That seems to be the case here. Many of the rites occurring before this central censing rite are repeated again after. So we have a libation before, a censing before, a natron washing before, a ritual meal before, and clothing rites that are appearing all before, but then you have them repeated again after that central censing. Additionally, most of the repeated rites in the latter group are described in the pyramid text as being of a greater magnitude than the former, suggesting some sort of progression from a lesser to a higher order. For examples, the first meal mentioned in the list is very small and simple, whereas the second meal is an elaborate feast. So when you walk into the non-royal tombs, you'll see just quantities of priestly figures carrying food substances and all kinds of things into the tomb, as it were, for this grand feast. The text describing the initial censing is the same text as the central censing, but the last censing has some additional intensifying lines in the pyramid text. Pyramid text 25 says, speaking to the incense, "You of great purity, let your scent be on Unis and purify Unis. May you become high and big towards Unis." Further, the ritual group after the central censing appears to be more complex than the first group, as it includes several additional rites not included in the first. Our purpose today will be to focus on the clothing rite appearing in both the first and second group of this sequence. With respect to the initial clothing rite, the priests appearing in the elite tombs at this point are typically shown grasping two long, thin objects. Some of these depictions, for example, the first and the third, sorry, I'm not sure what happened to my slides there. But the third one there, I guess, is the only one that kind of shows up properly, has a text label there at the top that says Wenechwi, which translates two rolls or strips of cloth. That's all we get in the non-royal tombs. Sometimes a picture can be worth 1,000 words, but sometimes you just need a little bit more information about what those 1,000 words should be. So fortunately, the pyramid texts also mention two strips of linen at this point in the sequence, but provide additional texts concerning this rite in particular. So what we have in connection with this rite is pyramid text 81 that states, "May you awake in peace. Awake, Tayit, in peace. Awake, you of Tayit town, in peace. You whom the made-up women receive, you who adorn the great one in the sedan chair." So Tayit is a goddess of ancient Egypt who personifies linen and weaving. In later periods at Dendera, texts refer to her as she who purifies the goddesses, who did spin of old and was the first to weave. That made-up women receive the linens of Tayit and that they adorn or decorate a great one implies that the two strips offering is actually something one wears. Indeed, in the text of Teti and Pepi I pyramids, the text links these two strips explicitly to the idea of being clothed. Ho, Teti, or Pepi, depending on which pyramid you're in, receive your dazzling garment. Receive your bleached garment on you, and get dressed in Horus's eye from Tayit town. The garments to be received in this initial clothing rite are bleached white and have the qualities of dazzling brightness. In the pyramid text, the Egyptian word translated here as dazzling garment is seshep, which literally means illuminate or light up. The word in this context appears written with a linen determinative. So seshep has a little picture of linen, as well as a sun with its rays shining down, suggesting shiny cloth. A standard Egyptian word for linen or fine linen, besus, is sheshru, seshru, but spelled earlier as sheshru. Weave is seshen, and the Egyptian six-weave linen is seis, from the word sesu, six. It's kind of hard to pronounce this because we don't have vowels, so kind of make up things as Egyptologists, stick E's between everything. Okay, so this is probably related to the Hebrew shesh or shaish, which is also related to the Hebrew word six, according to the BDB. So Margaret actually mentioned in a private communication to me a little while ago, actually, a couple years ago, that the two Hebrew words meaning fine linen is also, the Hebrew word for fine linen is also the word for marble, I guess, or shesh, suggesting the common idea that something that was smooth or polished. And we may have the similar kind of idea going on here in the ancient Egyptian tradition. The Egyptian word for alabaster is shes, and statue is shesep. So there seems to be some linguistic plays here going on between these terms. The appearance of the goddess Ta'it in the initial clothing of the offering list sequence connects us to another ritual progression. From the Middle Kingdom tale of Sunue, from about 1800 BC, we have this line: "A night is made for you with ointments and wrappings from the hand of Ta'it. A funeral procession is made for you on the day of burial." The Old Kingdom funeral procession contains a progressive series of rites that also includes some clothing rituals that may have some bearing here. The word Ta'it is the term the ancient Egyptians used for the bandages used to swaddle infants and to wrap a mummy. The Old Kingdom elite tomb of the vizier Ptah-hotep describes a funeral procession which appears to contain a reference at the beginning of the procession to a weaving house. The caption for this part of the scene is Shadat im per Yemenet Neferet Echer Necher A'a, proceeding from the weaving house to the beautiful west and before the great God. The determinative below the word per, house, that's the square-looking object, I'll highlight it there, looking hieroglyphic in the top line. So right below that, it's kind of hard to see in this slide, is a woman with a weaving apparatus, according to Juncker. Some scholars assume this weaving house was probably a reference to the dead's manor or estate, but in light of Ta'it's relationship to weaving and ritual clothing, perhaps this needs to be reevaluated. Part of the funeral procession depicted in elite tombs includes a stop at a ibu. Oh, sorry, what happened here? Let me go here. So part of the funeral procession depicted in elite tombs included a stop at a ibu, a purification tent, in the early stages. We learn from later sources that inside the purification tent, the body is washed and clothed, and that a curtain hangs therein. So let me go back. So here's one of the coffin texts mentioning this ibu. Hail Osiris, and then the name. You go down, you clean yourself with Re in the lotus pool. You put on clothes in the purification tent and leave behind its curtain. Possibly referencing this curtain, the coffin text mentioned elsewhere a curtain that Ptah has embroidered and Ta'it has woven herself. So the funeral processions from the Old Kingdom elite tomb of Kar at Giza includes a depiction of the purification tent, which Hofmeyr states shows the intricate detail of woven material. The weave across the top suggests the structure was itself woven from possibly reeds, being that this mythological place of purification in the pyramid text and otherwhere is the field of reeds. The weave pattern down the center could perhaps be the curtain that hangs in this house, partitioning it into the two ways. And so on the left and the right uprights, you have the hieroglyphics for way. The text in each compartment on the left side, above those chests, the text says the requirements of the lector priest, and then 2 chests. On the right, it says the requirements of the ibu, a meal. So in this purification tent, you have a washing, a clothing, and a small meal associated, similar to the initiation rites in the offering list that we looked at earlier. Mereruka's purification tent on the right has 2 hieroglyphics for doors at either end, and then right above it, that thin strip right above those door-looking is the hieroglyphic pet for sky. Blavatsky translates this, the doors of heaven, i.e. the gate by which you enter heaven is purification. Depictions of the funeral procession show that it approaches the ibu by water, so note the boat on the left, but then leaves the ibu on land across the desert as it heads west towards the wabet, which is referred to as the pure place, and then the tomb itself for the burial of the deceased. So you have 3 major stops of the funeral procession, one a purifying tent, and then the pure place, and then burial. Pyramid text utterance 415 is a prayer to the goddess of weaving and appears to describe her function as linen bindings for the deceased body. Greetings, Tayit. Care for the king's head so it does not pass away. Gather together the king's bones so that they will not pass away, and put the love of the king into the bowel of every god who shall see him. And as Margaret was speaking earlier, I was reminded of this because as she mentioned the Lady Wisdom, right, that she cast this net in the creation that gathers and brings things together, and we have that same idea here, where Tayit's bindings, gather together the bones of the deceased. So the second clothing rite in the ritual sequence is much more elaborate. The pyramid text indicates that the recipient is to be clad in leopard skin, a kilt, and reed sandals, as well as receive scepters and staves and other insignia, all which indicate the deceased king's power, or the deceased king's power to govern. These additional articles of clothing and insignia stand in contrast to the more simple wenekhu or nekwi ritual of the 2 strips of cloth that we mentioned earlier, or the bleached garments. The elite tomb of Hezi contains a brief sequence of the offering list rite that may contain a representation of this second clothing rite. We have a lector priest making an offering gesture, followed by another figure who brings a scepter or a baton in his hand. The label above him simply states, reciting a great many glorifications. Similar to the previous scene, the elite tomb of Ankh-Khephren from the 5th and 6th dynasty has him on the right, wearing the stole of the lector priest, while his brother, Iteti, stands right behind him in the same pose and baton as the previous slide, but with the additional detail of the leopard skin and kilt wrapped around his body. This second clothing rite suggests the recipient has moved to a higher order from the first clothing rite, which is again more simple, and now receiving royal-like regalia. So, some concluding remarks. In another study, I explored how the sequence and nature of the rites in the Egyptian pyramid texts and elite tombs are strikingly similar to the layout of ritual performances along the architectural path of the biblical temple tradition. There's no time to look at this in detail, but just simply to summarize, we have the libation, censing, washing, and simple meal, anointing, and the clothing in the linen of Tayit in the first set of rituals, recalling the libations, the censing, the washing, anointing, simple linen, and simple meal of the priest in connection with the altar and laver in the biblical temple courtyard. There's almost a one-for-one correspondence. The second group, the censing, the great meal, and additional clothing and insignia rites reflect the incense altar, the showbread table, right? It's this great meal as opposed to the simple meal of the sacrificial altar, and the high priest of the holy place, right? Other pyramid texts mention the lamp lighting ritual, and later Egyptian traditions place it at this stage of the sequence, matching the lamp of the biblical temple. These final rites, at the top here, include an execration giving power over enemies, a final censing, and a sealing, which has vague parallels, and which I wish we could go into. It's in my article, I already read on this, but with Old Testament temple traditions, but certainly much more explicitly restored in John's revelation in the New Testament. So finally, the Egyptians did not believe that the mere performance of these rituals alone proffered salvation. Their tombs equally assert that they also did those things which created ma'at, or order, such as giving food to the hungry, clothing to the naked, honoring their parents. For example, this text, I carried out ma'at, which is what the God loves. I perpetuated the God in respect of all that which he loves. I made invocation offerings for the ox, in other words, his deceased ancestors. I was respectful of my father and kind to my mother. I buried him who had no son. I ferried him over who had no boat. I rescued the wretched man from the more powerful one. I gave the share of the father to his son. The ritual instructions, as I mentioned earlier, as they perform these meal offerings, included the reversion of offerings, which takes the food back out and redistributes it to the people, typically of a lower order in their system. So the temples and the tomb chapels not only helped those who entered to look to heaven and contemplate the things of God, but they also reminded the same to look to their fellow man and to create on earth that same order, that same ma'at that exists in heaven. And that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My thanks to the Widtsoe Foundation for sponsoring this conference, and to Jack Welsh and Jacob Reneker for inviting me. My presentation today presents a small portion of the PhD dissertation that I completed 2 years ago, which concerned the social function of cloth and clothing in Israel's tabernacle. That dissertation was an anthropological study. It used 3 forms of data: the Hebrew Bible, extra-biblical literature, and archaeological evidence. Part of the thesis of that dissertation is that Aaron's consecration attire clearly identifies the high priest as on a par with ancient Near East kings and pharaohs, and conveys the status of the high priest as the one person of most elite status in the society reflected in the tabernacle narratives. The biblical data I'll be talking about today come from the tabernacle narratives of the book of Exodus. In the tabernacle narratives, the Lord instructs the Israelites to build a tabernacle and to make special garments in which to consecrate Aaron, who is the prototype high priest, and his sons, who are prototype priests. So specifically, the biblical passages that I'll be talking about today are from Exodus 28 and 39. The theme of our conference is Sacred Place, Sacred Thread. Appropriately, Aaron's garments are specifically described in the biblical text as being sacred. They are kodesh. Various English translations render the Hebrew term kodesh as sacred or holy, and render the word for clothing in this context as garments or vestments, as you see here. Verse 2 begins the introduction and overview of the description of Aaron's sacred vestments in Exodus 28. That overview continues with a list of Aaron's vestments: his breastpiece, ephod, and also a specially woven band that is associated with the ephod, robe, tunic of a particular weave structure, a unique headdress, and sash. And it then provides the information that there are 3 materials to be used: gold, dyed stuff, translated in the NRSV as blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and a particular type of linen. Following this introduction in Exodus 28, 2-5, the biblical text of the rest of chapter 28 goes on to give detailed descriptions of each of Aaron's liturgical garments, including information about every aspect of their manufacture. It talks about the fiber content, the special mode of spinning, the luxury dyes that are used, the different weave structures involved for different garments, and there are specific details about the design elements, such as the multiple hems, the pendants, and the neck opening of Aaron's robe, for example. Unfortunately, we don't understand every one of those details, especially the ones that invoke technical weaving terms. But the fact that they're all included in the narrative clearly indicates that the biblical writers considered each to be significant. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on just two of these many details that the text provides about Aaron's consecration attire, both of which depend upon the fact that Aaron's sacred vestments are made using the dyed stuff. The first detail that I'll focus on is the fact that Aaron's robe is entirely of blue, or is of pure blue. So that you know where I'm going here, let me tell you now that my conclusion will be that the cloth used for Aaron's robe is an example of the sumptuousness of the high priestly sacred clothing, and as part of the evidence presented by the biblical authors, the high priest is on a par with contemporary kings. The second detail on which I'll focus is that Aaron's ephod, the specially woven band associated with it, and his breastpiece are all woven from a combination of the dyed stuff and fine linen. My conclusion about this will be that the combination of materials used in the high priestly sacred clothing serves to distinguish the high priest from all other Israelites. We begin with Aaron's robe. In order to understand the significance of the fact that it's made entirely of blue-dyed material, I need to give you an overview of the three dyes that are referred to throughout the tabernacle narratives. The Hebrew phrase, which is rendered in the NRSV as blue, purple, and crimson yarns, occurs over 25 times in the tabernacle narratives. The three individual terms in that phrase are used biblically to designate colors and materials dyed in those colors. And in the secondary literature, the terms are also used to refer to the dyes themselves. With respect to their colors, you should visualize the first as a purplish blue, the second as a reddish purple, and the third possibly as a purplish red, although I can't rule out that it might have been instead an orangish red. All three dyes are animal-based. Hundreds of plants have been used to create dyes, but very few animal species. According to Dominique Carden, the recognized authority on natural dyeing, there are only about 25 animal species altogether that have been used for dye production. About 15 species of mollusks, all of which produce purples such as the first and second dyes on our list, and about 10 species of scale insects, all of which produce reds such as the third dye on our list. Animal-based dyes create brighter colors than plant-based dyes, are color-fast, and labor-intensive. Thus, quoting Carden, animal dyes represent extreme examples of the role of colored textiles as status symbols. Aaron's robe was made entirely of material dyed with the purplish blue. This dye and the reddish purple that is second on the list together were known as the sea purples. The sources of the sea purples in ancient Mediterranean world were two species of sea snail, or murex, and one species of rock shell. All three are mollusks of the same family, and all three yield a red-violet colorant, leading to the reddish purple of the second dye on our list. In addition, the particular sea snail called Murex trunculus, the first one on our list, is unique in yielding, in addition to the red-violet colorant, the same blue colorant that is found in indigo plants. One way of manufacturing dye from this sea snail yields a very dark violet blue, the combination of red-violet and indigo blue. However, if the last stage in the manufacturing process is done in direct sunlight, the red-violet colorants oxidize, leaving only the indigo colorants, so that the resulting color is a purplish blue similar to indigo. There is considerable archaeological and extra-biblical evidence for all three of these dyes, or the materials dyed with them, being among the most precious objects in the ancient Near East. For example, dyed stuff from the Levantine shores were so consistently taken as booty or demanded as tribute by conquerors that by the 14th century BCE, the Hittite word for the reddish purple term had also come to mean tribute. And of course, more than half a millennium after the book of Exodus was written, The reddish purple was the indicator of high status for men and women in Roman antiquity, ultimately becoming the imperial purple reserved for the emperor. The biblical evidence makes it clear that for the priestly rite authors of the tabernacle narratives, of the three dyes, the first one on the list, the purplish blue, was the most valuable of all. The most obvious demonstration of this is that the priestly writers consistently list things in decreasing order of importance, with the most important item first. And when they itemize these three colors, purplish blue is always listed before the other two. The text devotes 4 verses to a description of Aaron's robe, beginning with the information that it is to be made entirely of the purplish blue material. My analysis of the full description of that robe indicates that the robe uses a lot of cloth, at least as much as 3 times as would be needed for a simple tunic style of garment. This is an ostentatiously superfluous use of the most sumptuous possible cloth known to the biblical writers. The wearer of such a garment would have been immediately identifiable by anyone in the ancient Near East as a person of extreme elite status. To repeat what I said earlier, the cloth used for Aaron's robe is an example of the sumptuousness of high priestly sacred clothing, and is part of the evidence presented by the biblical authors that the high priest is on a par with contemporary kings. The second point on which I want to focus is the fact that Aaron's most important garments liturgically, the ephod, a specially woven band associated with the ephod, and the breastpiece, are all woven from a combination of the dyed stuff and fine linen. I've shared with you some of the information about the 3 dye terms in the recurring phrase about dyed stuff that is used so consistently in the tabernacle narratives. What I haven't said yet is that the recurring phrase must refer to dyed wool. There are several lines of evidence for this. First, the only 2 fibers in common use in the ancient Near East at this time were linen and wool, so that the dyed materials must have been either linen or wool. The biblical text itself, with its clear distinction between the fine linen and the dyed stuff, strongly suggests that the dyed stuff was not linen. Therefore, it was wool. Second, white wool can be dyed easily, but the physical properties of linen make it difficult to dye. Third, there is archaeological evidence for the dyeing of wool with all 3 of the purplish blue, reddish purple, and orangish red dyes. Fourth, there are extra biblical texts in which the 3 color terms are unambiguously synonymous with dyed wool. And thus the authoritative Chicago Assyrian Dictionary defines cognates of the first 2 terms as a precious blue-purple wool and red-purple wool, respectively. The insight that the dyed materials are wool is hardly original with me. As a matter of fact, biblical commentators who explicitly mention the fiber content of the dyed materials universally call them wool. However, I suspect it might be a surprise to some that Aaron's garments are to be woven of dyed wools and linen, given the well-known biblical prohibitions. Oh, I got off by 1. So that's the slide for the stuff I've been talking about. So, given the well-known biblical prohibitions in Leviticus and Deuteronomy against putting on a garment made of 2 different materials and against wearing clothes made of wool and linen woven together, respectively. As it happens, there is no inherent conflict between the Lord's commandment that Aaron, as prototype high priest, is to wear garments of wool and linen woven together, and the Lord's commandment that Israelites in general are never to wear garments of wool and linen woven together. Those pair of commandments together constitute an example of a sumptuary law, a law which either forbids or prescribes the wearing of specific styles by specific classes of people. In this case, Israelites in general are forbidden to wear garments like the sacred ones prescribed for the high priest. This is all tied up, of course, with the fact that Aaron's garments are sacred, holy, and that only Aaron or his successors as high priest may wear these sacred threads, and then only in certain circumstances. are numerous examples of sumptuary laws in history. One famous example is the reservation of imperial purple, the second of our 3 dyes, for garments of the Emperor of Rome. The effect of the biblical sumptuary law pertaining to the wearing of the garments of wool and linen woven together is that the high priest is distinguished from all other Israelites. So, in conclusion, I have presented 2 examples from the many details provided in the tabernacle narratives of the book of Exodus about the sacred vestments that constitute Aaron's consecration attire. The first of these is that Aaron's robe is entirely of blue, or is of pure blue. I conclude that the cloth used for Aaron's robe is an example of the sumptuousness of the high priestly sacred clothing, and is part of the evidence presented by the biblical authors that the high priest is on a par with contemporary kings. The second is that Aaron's ephod, the specially woven band associated with it, and his breastpiece are all woven from a combination of dyed wool and fine linen. And I conclude that this combination of materials used in the high priestly sacred clothing serves to distinguish the high priest from all other Israelites. And I chose to focus on these 2 aspects of Aaron's sacred vestments or holy garments for this conference presentation in the hopes of triggering an interesting discussion, perhaps involving the comparison between the way that the Israelites' high priest's sacred threads set him apart from his co-religionists on the one hand, and the ways in which liturgical garb functions in contemporary worship environments on the other hand. Thank you.
Okay, well, the puzzle I hope to solve today is this. How is it possible for perhaps the most well-known man without clothes in the Hebrew Bible to be compared with perhaps the most well-known man wearing the most sacred of clothes in Jewish thought? And those are the best representations I could find of both of those. During Judaism's Second Temple period, several authors drew connections between the temple and the creation stories recorded in Genesis, even going so far as to describe the Israelite high priest and his clothing in terms of Adam. I will examine several texts written during this period of time in order to tease out what interpreters saw as Adam's priestly role in Eden, and will explore how these authors may have discerned such ideas from the very first chapters of Genesis. The temple in Jerusalem stood as the focal point of Israelite religion when it was destroyed by the Babylonians in the late 6th century BCE. Having been forcefully estranged from this beating heart of their religious life, Jewish exiles in Babylon possessed a heightened sensitivity to the temple and its related imagery. Such sensitivity is evident in the biblical writings of Ezekiel. In describing his vision of the temple, Ezekiel uses language evocative of Eden, humanity's very first and perhaps most important home. For instance, this is evident in the regular appearance of cherubim, a very specific type of heavenly being, in Ezekiel's narrative. While the many gates of this visionary temple's courtyards were all decorated with garden-like palm trees, the walls of the temple's holiest area were all decorated with palm trees and cherubim, while only the eastward-facing doors of the temple's most sacred spaces were entirely dominated by cherubim. This, of course, is suggestive of Adam's eastward expulsion from Eden. Genesis states that the cherubim were placed, quote, at the east of the Garden of Eden to prevent a westward return to that garden. This correlation between Eden and the temple may explain the particular term that God uses consistently to address Ezekiel in his temple visions. The phrase Ben Adam can be translated as both mortal and as son of Adam. The image of Ezekiel as a priestly son of Adam becomes even more significant when we take into account the fact that only the high priest was authorized to enter the temple's Holy of Holies, where both the doors to this most sacred room and the Ark of the Covenant within this sacred space were guarded by cherubim, as was the Garden of Eden. Earlier in the book of Ezekiel, the author made this connection between Adam and the Israelite priesthood more explicit. Chapter 28 describes Eden as being at the top of a mountain and uses language evocative of the Israelite tabernacle and temple to describe it. The text also refers to an inhabitant of this sacred space as wearing precious stones, similar to those worn by Aaron as he officiated in the tabernacle and is shown there on the right-hand side. In the verses that follow, God explains that because of this individual's, quote, sin, and then this is what follows, I cast him out as a profane thing from the mountain of God, or Eden. Thus, it appears as though the individual banished from Eden was wearing priestly attire before being expelled, which also seems to imply that this individual was performing priestly duties within the garden. This then seems to be an early connection between Adam and the ornate priestly clothing, which was presumably manufactured by God in the garden. After the Jerusalem temple was rebuilt by the Jewish people in the early 6th century CE, a time that's referred to as the Second Temple period, several authors made similar yet more expansive conceptual connections between Eden and creation as they wrote about this restored temple. These texts suggest a creative and complex understanding of what the temple, its rituals, and its worshipers symbolized. For instance, several authors suggested that the temple was symbolic of Eden and that the high priest was a representative of Adam. As we will see, from this perspective, the Israelite high priest effectively reversed humanity's expulsion from the presence of God. One example of such thinking was written by the author of Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, which states that the tabernacle and temple ritual somehow restored what was lost through Adam and Eve's disobedience in Eden. According to this account, God showed Moses, quote, the measurements of the sanctuary and the number of the offerings, and the signs by which they shall begin to examine the heavens. And God said, these are the things which were forbidden to the race of men after they had sinned. This likely reference to Adam and Eve's actions in Eden suggests these first parents lost privileges that humans should have retained in other circumstances. The construction of the tabernacle and its various rituals, in part, seem to have restored certain of these privileges that were lost. Here, then, God gives Israel a significant role in affairs that affect humanity as a whole. Thus, the creation of the tabernacle and temple could be seen as functional replacements for Eden's primal sacred space. The book of Jubilees also makes conceptual ties between Eden, Adam, and the temple. In this text, Adam and Eve are created outside of the garden. God brings Adam and Eve into the garden, but at different times, making clear that this action reflects the priestly laws governing entrance to the temple in Leviticus chapter 12, and suggests that the Garden of Eden had a similar level of sanctity as did the temple. This particular idea is made explicit in Jubilees chapter 8, where the narrator describes Noah as knowing, quote, that the Garden of Eden is the Holy of Holies and the dwelling of the Lord. The significance of this statement can be summarized in the following. If Adam and Eve were brought into the Holy of Holies prior to their disobedience, then their expulsion from Eden was a removal from the place where God's presence was most immediate for Israel. The high priest's entry into the Holy of Holies on the holy day of Yom Kippur would symbolically correspond to the first man's return to Eden, albeit temporarily. Interpretations of Adam's apparel suggest an additional priestly connection. In the Wisdom of Ben Sira in Hebrew, we find a list of several biblical figures whose grave sites were visited by their faithful descendants. The author then writes, after this list of ancestors, that, quote, above every living thing is the beauty of Adam. The very next verse begins, quote, greatest of his brothers and the beauty of his people was Simeon, the son of Johanan the priest, in whose generation the house was visited and in whose days the temple was strengthened. So while a passing reference to Adam just before a sustained description of Simeon may seem like a non sequitur, this juxtaposition was not haphazard. The description of Simeon as the beauty or tipperet of his people establishes more than a formal link with the preceding chapter, where the beauty or tipperet of Adam is named. Here, the author implies that Adam's clothing is analogous to Simeon's high priestly robes. If so, he may suggest here that the high priest's clothing are the garments of the first man, which God made before expelling him from Eden. In any case, the wisdom of Ben Sira establishes at the very least a conceptual connection between the perception of Adam and the perception of the Jewish high priest Simeon as he functioned within the Jerusalem temple. This comparison suggests that the author saw the high priest as a latter-day representative of Adam, and that the regular rituals performed in the temple were, in fact, offered on behalf of the whole world. From this perspective, then, the aforementioned privileges originally granted to Adam in Eden were recapitulated in Simeon, the high priest, who offered sacrifices on behalf of humanity within the latter-day equivalent of Eden. Taken together, these several Second Temple texts display a complex understanding of how the temple and its priests were conceptually related to Eden and Adam, that the temple itself was in some way a recreation of Eden, and that the rituals performed by the temple's priests made restitution not only for Adam and Eve's disobedience, but that the temple ritual was also made positive offerings on behalf of the entire human race. In what follows, I will demonstrate why this interpretation was plausible and perhaps natural by focusing on the language and imagery used in the Eden narrative, and will outline how the idea of a priestly Adam was a real interpretive possibility in Genesis 2-3. The very first verbal cues that alert us to Adam's priestly responsibilities occur in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Here, God takes the man and places him in the Garden of Eden, quote, to till it and keep it. These verbs are elsewhere translated as serve and keep or guard, and are most often used together to describe the priestly actions of serving God and keeping or guarding God's word. With this connection in mind, some have suggested that if Eden is seen as an ideal sanctuary, then perhaps Adam should be described as an ideal Israelite priest. Other elements within Genesis 2 and 3 point to an understanding of Eden's inhabitants as functioning within temple-related sacred space. The prohibition against eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil stated that if this was violated, Adam would, quote, surely die. This is significant because, according to early Jewish interpreters, the tabernacle was seen as the center of life because God was present there, and to be excluded from the camp of Israel was to enter the realm of death. From this perspective, then, God's statement that Adam and Eve would surely die if they ate a particular fruit was less about the length of their lives as it was about their ability to remain ritually pure within a particular sacred space. This concept of maintaining ritual purity within such space points us back to Adam's responsibilities in the Garden of Eden, to serve and keep or guard it. For Israelite priests, one notable aspect of guarding meant protecting the tabernacle and temple from ritually impure individuals or creatures entering its precincts. It may have been possible to see the entrance of the serpent, an unclean animal, according to Leviticus 11, as a failure on Adam's part to guard the temple-like Garden of Eden. The cherubim's stated purpose of guarding the sacred space of Eden could then be interpreted as God's replacement of Adam as caretaker of Eden's sacredness. As the cherubim's duties are described using the same verb that outlines Adam's responsibility to guard the garden in the previous chapter, it may be inferred that Adam's duty there was priestly in nature. Two final elements suggest a priestly context for understanding the roles of Adam and Eve within the garden. These appear in the description of their actions, as well as the actions of God after Adam and Eve ate of the fruit. Upon hearing the voice of God in the garden, they hid themselves, quote, from the presence of the Lord God. It has been suggested elsewhere that, in general, any ritual activity using the phrase before the Lord can be considered an indication of a temple at the site, since this expression stems from the basic conception of the temple as a divine dwelling place and actually belongs to the temple's technical terminology. If this is the case, then Adam and Eve's previous actions within the garden could have been viewed as paralleling the actions of priests in the Israelite tabernacle and temple. This suggestion is strengthened by the actions of God that follow Adam and Eve's indictment. God clothes them with garments of skin. The same verb meaning to clothe appears several times in passages that describe Moses' clothing the priests of the tabernacle with garments, again, the same word that's used in Genesis, suggesting that God's clothing of Adam and Eve could be seen by its audience as having had priestly overtones. So in conclusion, the inclusion of Eve in these temple-oriented passages certainly complicates the idea of an all-male priesthood in ancient Israel. It may, however, help to account for several intriguing texts that use temple imagery to describe both Eve and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Nevertheless, from the aforementioned Second Temple writings, it is clear that there was a common perception of Adam in the Genesis narratives as a sort of priestly figure, an idea so potent that it was seen by some as radiating into the present from primeval times, and by others as an interpretive lens through which to illuminate the stories of humanity's beginnings. While some ancient interpreters saw Adam as being dressed in sacred clothing, presumably manufactured by God, while walking about Eden, many others, at the very least, saw similarities between the role and function of Adam in Eden and that of the high priest in the Jerusalem temple. This idea of one person making offerings to God on behalf of humanity as a whole endowed both the space of the Jewish temple and the threads worn by the high priest with sacred significance. Thank you.
So I'd like to start by reminding you that there's been some cards passed around, or there will be passed around for you to formulate some questions, and those will be collected and handed up here, and we can raise some of those. I'd like to begin, before we get to those questions, by bringing us sort of together to the theme of this section, which is that of sacred clothing. We've seen some fascinating but very different presentations of clothing in sacred context, from the dazzling clothing of ancient Egypt that corresponds to pyramid texts, to the intricate details of sacred vestments from Exodus, which draws similarities to kingship within ancient Israel, to more subtle, even absence of clothing in the account of Adam, but all within context of related to clothing and relating to deity. So I'd like to start by posing a question that each of our respondents or our presenters can address as they see fit, and then allow some time for them to dialogue among themselves about that or other related issues, and then we'll turn to your questions. So I guess the question that I would like to raise for our presenters is, in your work on these sacred, on these garments, the subtle presentation or the absence of garments, the articulation, the details with the sacred blue, the dazzling white garment in the Egyptian context, what does that indicate about how, in these religious contexts, these authors, these people, these communities understood their relationship to their deity? In other words, what was it? Why was it dazzlingly white and not dazzlingly gold and red? Is that our color here at USC? Or some other, or something else? So what does the details and the things that you're unearthing for us, what does that tell us about how these people viewed their relationship to their deity? So I'll allow anybody to answer that as you see fit.
All right, I'll start. Well, I think I don't know how widespread, how common it is in the world, But it certainly seems to be the case that in ancient Egypt that they prized, at least on the initial clothing ritual, the concept of brightness and possibly white. I think bright and white are kind of interchangeable translations of both Hebrew and Greek concepts. And so is it white that they're really looking for? I mean, it does mention a bleached, so it is, I think, a bleached garment. So we would say yes, white, but also this idea of luminosity, I think, is also implied, that as you're approaching God, right, that you are becoming filled with light. And so there's that concept. But then there's the typical standard definition that whiteness kind of suggests a purity. And certainly it's purification rituals that are these initial rituals that they're participating in. The tent in the funerary procession as a purification tent. And so this notion of becoming pure, in your initial approaches to God, and then having the vestments of kingly regalia and other things put on later. So that's one way of looking at it. So.
My impression is that everything that is described about Aaron's consecration attire is designed, there's a phrase that's translated in the New Revised Standard Version, English translation, as glorious adornment. And it uses words having to do with beauty, as Jacob talked about. The beauty is one of those words, glory is one of those words. There's different ways of translating them so that you can see it actually says in the text in some translations for beauty and magnificence or something like that. I forget the exact words that are in the various translations. So my impression is that the description of the clothing is designed to describe Aaron as gloriously clothed, gloriously adorned, and that must have something to do with God's magnificence and glory, and the reflection of that in Aaron's sacred consecration attire.
This is interesting in terms of Eden, where God clearly doesn't have a problem with nakedness, right? Because they're walking around without anything initially. So, whereas with the Egyptian, this idea of purity before God, I don't know if that was something that was then latent there in Eden that didn't require clothing, but at the very least, you see clothing initially as a response to the deity and their perception of what should be considered appropriate, I suppose. But then you have God actually formalizing clothing in the creation of garments. And so with the relationship between the high priest's garments and Adam's garments, at the very least, the garments that are made by God, they're just immediately preceding the expulsion. I think you see God setting a precedent for a particular type of clothing, that God, in essence, kind of consecrates clothing at that point. And then that precedent is followed, and that particular, at least that image of the type of clothing that Adam was wearing or seen to be wearing, that idea is then preserved in the clothing of the high priest, who is the representative par excellence of humanity before God. So in one sense, it could perhaps be seen as glorious because God created it in one sense, and that was what God expected from the high priest and the Israelites. But the idea of nakedness in the first place kind of complicates this issue of clothing, what it means in terms of relationship between deity and Israel.
Sure.
Can I respond?
Please.
So I guess I had some thoughts, about the nakedness concept at least in the Hebrew Bible, because I think in the Hebrew, right, the nakedness of Adam and Eve is arumim, right, and you have the nakedness of the serpent mentioned as well, the arum, same word. It's translated subtle, but I've always wondered, and I don't know if this is correct, but I've always wondered if that nakedness concept of Adam and Eve and the serpent is this notion of being exposed, right, to to God's justice. Adam and Eve, of course, were not ashamed because they had not broken any law yet, and so their nakedness does not seem to be a problem. But as soon as they break a law, right, then they need protection, and they cover their nakedness, whereas the serpent is more naked, right, than all the beasts of the field, without any protection. So I don't know, that's one way I've looked at that and tried to reconcile.
One question that's come up that I think is really interesting is, what, if anything, is the place for clothing, sacred or otherwise, in afterlife? In any of the texts that you've studied, is there a place for what is Adam wearing in heaven, or even within the Egyptian rites with the dazzling clothing? Is there something that on the other side of this life that there's the clothing changes, or is there what if anything is the place of those?
Well, if you're going strictly from the Hebrew Bible, that's I can't think of any shade or spirit of an individual, their clothing described, certainly not anything glorious that I can think of, but like in terms of second temple tradition, later, right, in interpretations, you do have, well, I guess it depends on how some of these texts are read, right? Qumran, you have certain texts where these communities are apparently having exchanges, or depending on how you read the text, exchanges with angels, if the angels are external to the community in Songs of Sabbath sacrifice, for instance, where there's these luminous beings that are being described wearing priestly clothing,
Right.
but also there's a way that of reading those texts as kind of a priestly initiation text. So if this kind of priestly community is mirroring the angels in heaven and what they're wearing, then you have kind of this angelomorphic humanity that's kind of taking on the identity of these radiantly clothed angels wearing priestly clothing. So in terms of what that would mean in terms of like afterlife, I'm not sure, but in terms of a heavenly realm, you could say, at least from those texts, the texts that I'm familiar with, that in heaven you do have descriptions of heavenly beings wearing the very priestly clothing that is being described in the temple.
And that's a good question. This document, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifices, is intended as a liturgical work that invokes heavenly worship for the Jews at Qumran that didn't have access to a temple. So they're worshiping within an idealized temple. So they're seeing these priestly garments in the heavenly sanctuary, perhaps worn by angels. There's some other fun things happening in there that we'll talk about tomorrow. But yeah, what does that infer about the presence of these in afterlife, or is it just invoking worship? Yeah, that's difficult. Anything from the Egyptian?
I think that yeah, just moving in these ritual progressions, right, that you have in the offering lists ritual and also in the funerary rituals of putting on those dazzling white clothes or bandages or whatever first, and then of course clothing that further with kingly like regalia. So we get it in the progression towards heaven, or towards the sky as they join with Re in the solar bark, right? And so, and I assume, although having not really looked at this question individually or particularly, I assume that as they move through that progression, they keep obviously what they have as a symbol of not only their purity but also their rights to rule, as the texts indicate when they get the sandals and the leopard skin and the staves and the scepters, that now they have power and authority, and whether and of course you see the gods depicted that way in the depictions of the gods in later periods, wearing and holding all of that regalia.
I'm curious about this question of the sanctuary, the location where these sacred garments are worn as being a sacred space. And I'm wondering if perhaps Dr. Billington sees in her work, if she sees the sacred space as corresponding to Eden, as well as Dr. Renneker has seen, and if there are points of correspondence to seeing, there's the notion that the tabernacle is a perfect cube. There are later traditions that say that Eden is cube-like, and so I'm wondering if there's anything you could say about the sacred space, Edenic sacred space.
Yes, to the first part of your question, but I'm going to pass on the second part too. As Margaret has pointed out, and many of you know, the cloths of the tabernacle are also, they are the same kinds of cloths that are used to make up Aaron's robes, Aaron's garments. And there is a similar progression of specialness to the cloths as you get deeper and deeper into the more holy parts of the tabernacle. So in the same way that you have the description of increased valuation of the metals as you get to the interior, the actual cloths themselves increase in value as you get to the Holy of Holies, so that the Holy of Holies itself is made up of the most prestigious, hardest to make, most valuable, most special textiles known to the writers. So they delineate the spatial areas of holiness by the quality of the cloth, and that corresponds in part to the variation of Aaron's sacred vestments. But the cloths of the tabernacle, I suspect, were as valuable, if not more so, than the gold and the silver that was there, and the cedars from Lebanon.
With the Genesis story and viewing Eden as a temple or tabernacle-related space, and you run into difficulties because in that case, it seems that Adam and Eve are given these clothing on the way out. It's their kind of parting gift, consolation prize, or souvenir. It's something that this clothing is given to them upon exiting the sacred space of the temple. So it's almost reversed in the sense of typically, putting on the sacred clothing in order to go into the sacred space. Here initially in the Eden narrative, it seems to be kind of the opposite direction, unless, of course, you follow the kind of strands of interpretation that Adam was wearing some sort of priestly clothing before, while he was in Eden, as kind of suggested in Ezekiel. But also, you have a different tradition that Adam was wearing skins of light, or they were not skins of light, but kind of garments of light. That he originally had garments of light that were replaced with garments of skin upon exiting Eden. So there was some sort of kind of primal, sacred, holy something that either Adam had inherently or was put upon him by God, which was then stripped off and then replaced for these earthier skin garments. But that's just one particular trajectory.
Yeah, the difficulty here obviously is dealing with what's explicit in ancient texts versus what is inferred in later texts that might reflect earlier traditions as well. If either of you have questions for one another, please feel free to raise them. Otherwise, I will keep going with some of these very helpful questions. Again, we're back to Dr. Renneker with respect to especially Eve, the question of Adam's clothing and Adam's potential priesthood. Is there a place in these traditions for Eve as a priestess, or in any kind of clothing or anything of that respect?
Yeah, that's a fun rabbit hole I gladly go down. So in the traditions that I've looked at, there isn't an idea of Eve as a priestess, kind of functioning the same way. But with Eve as a sort of temple herself. So you have in Genesis Rabbah, so later Jewish interpretations of what's happening in Genesis, that when it's kind of recounting Eve's creation, you have two things that are happening. One, kind of picking up on what Eve was created out of and how Eve was created from that. So she's created from the rib of Adam. The same word, that word, particular word, rib, just literally means side. And so in commenting on that particular verse that God took from the side of Adam and made Eve, one of the commentators draws an explicit parallel between the side of the tabernacle and the side that becomes Eve. So you kind of have this kind of web of association between Eve as part of some sort of sacred structure. But in the verb that's used to describe the creation of Eve, that is different from the verb that's used to describe the creation of Adam. So Adam, it's yatsar, it's to mold, to form something. For Eve, the verb that's used is banah, it's to build something. And many of the words that are used to describe the temple talk about it as a building. Especially in 1 Kings, most of the terms are used to relate to the temple. I think it is in chapter 8, specifically referred to it as this kind of building par excellence. And so Eve is built in the same way that the temple is built. So in other instances, there's some funny ideologies for how does one of the commentators in Genesis Rabbah asks, why are women created wider in the hips and narrower above? And the answer is, all right, to be able to store babies, just like the rooms were created in the temple to store temple treasures. So you have this kind of equivalence of woman and temple for certain things. And so while Eve doesn't take on this kind of participatory ritual role of priestess, you do see her described in terms of the temple, that kind of transfer that sort of sacred imagery of sacred space, of the structure itself, rather than the function within that sacred space. If that makes sense.
I think this next question could apply to all three of our presenters, and that is this notion of these sacred garments with respect to one's relationship with God or a God, and be given by God's instructions. What is would it be true to say that all rituals or sacred clothing are in some sense coming from God? Or perhaps what is the role of God in instituting these instructions for sacred clothing and thus enhancing its importance and value and so forth?
From the Egyptian side of things, it's pretty easy. At least in later depictions, it's usually the gods that are bringing these objects that are going to be used. So you have actually a depiction of Ta'it carrying the two strips herself, as opposed to the male priest that we had in the Old Kingdom depictions. And so there seems to be a notion that these things do originate from God or the gods, and and then just in general, even the word hieroglyphics in the Egyptian is medu necher, which means the word of God, right? And so everything that's spoken and given, especially like in these pyramid texts and everything, are God-given instructions.
But do you have instructions like we have in the Hebrew Bible, where it's God-given instructions on how to construct the garments?
Right.
Or is it just like the Hebrew Bible, or is it just the gods delivering these to them?
Yeah, there may be. I'm not aware of any that are actual instructions on how to create or build, but it's a good question.
I have actually a question for you, John. So with you mentioned the Ta'it was it? So do you have depictions of her wrapping or swaddling infants in those clothing? It's not her, but that she's
But her
associated.
name, her
the
name,
name
Taït, is then becomes Taïtet, which is the actual bandages that are swaddling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And are those used beyond just receiving children and priestly garments? Are those that particular type of clothing, is that used in other areas of Egyptian life, or is it strictly ritual and newborn children?
As far as death, right? It's a mummy, and so I think that's the only ones I'm aware of.
Okay.
Those they kind of cross over, and it's and it's interesting again that you have women at these intersections, right, where you have the idea of the deceased, moving through this progression in the afterlife, and as they pass through different transitions of holiness, is usually a goddess who's there. So I think a couple years ago when we did the Temple Academy session on the Lady of the Temple, right? I presented one there on how there's usually goddesses at the horizon, or in other words, the doors of the temple, as they transition the person from one stage of existence to the other, which equates nicely with birth, right? And so the idea of a woman being there to bring the priest into this new realm and to clothe it, to swaddle it, kind of thing is kind of an interesting connection or parallel.
So is that, so would kind of a swaddling of a child, would there be parallels there to the ritual clothing of priests and the ritual clothing of deceased?
Yep.
In a sense?
Yep.
That's
at least that
fascinating.
initial clothing ritual.
Right,
Yep.
right.
Yep.
And are there descriptions of of the actual swaddling clothing, how long they're wearing it, what they do with it afterwards?
Not that I'm aware of, but there might be. So
that's fascinating.
This other question is for Dr. Billington, pertains to the stones on the sacred garments. Can you speak to the 12 stones embedded or hidden within the ephod and their role in sacredness?
Possibly. I did not focus on the 12 stones. I have not focused on the 12 stones in quite a while. I did look at the lists of, there's 3 lists of stones in the Hebrew Bible, in the Bible, 2 in the Hebrew Bible and 1 in the book of Revelation. And I did spend some time looking at those lists a number of years ago. What I was doing with them, however, was not paying attention to what their role is in terms of the sacredness of the high priest's clothing. The biblical text in some English translations says that those stones will be like signet seals, but the actual Hebrew says that they are signet seals. The high priest wears those 12 stones when he goes before God, and on each of those 12 stones is the name of one of the tribes. And each of the stones is actually set in gold, and I was able to show the similarity between the description that the Bible gives for those 12 stones in their settings of gold worn on the chest, with how signet seals were worn and used at the time. So they have clearly something to do with representing the people as the high priest is in the presence of God. So related to sacredness there, but it actually has been a fairly long time since I spent much time with those stones.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. This next one is for Dr. Renneker again. about Adam's, his clothing. When in his life did he receive the clothing? Is it given any specific name or title, either in the Hebrew Bible or subsequent tradition? And is there anything said about Eve's clothing and anything different between Adam and Eve's clothing? Since that's a rabbit hole you enjoy running down, why don't we
love
just
that one.
keep going down that
Let's
rabbit
just
hole?
keep on going. I'm not aware of any depictions of Eve's clothing. All the focus and gaze, if you will, is just on Adam there and what he's wearing, because it's seen as tied to the Israelite high priest. So there it's tough. So in at least in later traditions, you have God as the one who is making the priestly clothing. So it's made by God as his exit prize from Eden, and not after. And then in some strands of tradition, it's actually the garment that God made for Adam that is then handed down to children, that then the priest is inheriting in some sense. It's not clear. Usually the focus is on the garment going to Adam's direct posterity, and you have Nimrod stealing the garment, which is given as explanation for why he was able to hunt beasts, was because Adam had control over the animals, or a special relationship with the animals, and when they saw Nimrod wearing Adam's garments, they approached him, and Nimrod just was able to kill all of the animals right there. It was a little unfair on Nimrod's part, but it was that was an explanation for why Nimrod was such a mighty hunter. It was because he was kind of part of this receiving line, had actually stolen these garments. So there was something powerful inherent in the garments themselves, because God made them and kind of endowed them with some sort of extra sacredness. But in those traditions that I've studied, nothing is said about Eve's garment, a parallel set of clothing for Eve that's handed down that has similar properties. It's always just fixated on Adam's garments. So that's the best that you can go down the rabbit hole of Eve and what she's wearing. Now, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, you have some parallels between Eve and what's happening there, with Eve being described in temple terms. In early Christian interpreters, you have a few who refer to her as the Ark of the Covenant specifically, who housed the manna, right, which is God made flesh, so some tangible something that's sacred and preserved. So Mary then takes on this kind of tabernacle, temple item like sacrality, which was necessary to house the incarnate Son of God. So, but in terms, and so you have other depictions of Mary as, just as you have the high priest kind of reversing what Adam is doing there. So Adam leaving the garden, and the high priest kind of reversing that and returning to Eden. In later Christian traditions, you have Mary serving the same function, but in terms of the female side. So it's Mary that's reversing what Eve is doing. And so if the focus is on Eve as the one who is initially introducing some sort of sin or wrong into the order of creation in Eden, then Mary serves to reverse that initial sin by woman in producing the Son of God. So you have kind of interesting parallels there in Christianity in terms of the role of women in reversing processes of things that were started in Eden.
One final question or kind of comment pertains to the early Christian traditions, especially with relation to Jesus, who is depicted and described in the book of Hebrews as the great high priest, but I don't think in Hebrews is depicted with priestly garments, which I'm inviting comment from anybody, but also where you do see him clothed is in Revelation, when he's, or even at the Transfiguration, when his garments are dazzlingly white. It really struck me when I heard your description of these garments from Egypt, because he's a high priest, but he's not depicted in priestly clothing, and when his clothing is described, it is not in high priestly garb. It is in dazzling white. And then, of course, similar depiction in Revelation. I don't know if anybody, those are just observations. It wasn't really a question there.
I just have one quick thing there. So yeah, so in Hebrews, you have Jesus as the high priest, and in the description of what Jesus is doing and functioning as high priest, there's this idea of one offering sacrifice for many, right? And so if you look at the Israelite high priest, so that's essentially what he's doing is this one for many. It's something that Paul picks up on in Romans about Jesus Christ's sacrifice, one for many. That appears to be temple related, right? So and you have something similar even to kind of tying to that particular imagery in 1 Corinthians 15, where Jesus is described as the last Adam, right?
Right.
So first Adam, last Adam. So then Jesus as the high priest in Hebrews, when you're looking at that in relationship to 1 Corinthians 15 in particular, you can see some kind of resonances there in terms of Adam, high priest, Jesus as reversing what's happening here at the beginning through these ritual means that are happening in the temple originally.
Right. And of course, Jesus is both the high priest and the sacrifice,
Right.
as well as in the book of Hebrews. Yeah, it's interesting that in those kind of contexts that all the language of priestly garments seems to be not present.
Well, but the garments that I've been describing and that are the cloths that are part of the tabernacle, those weren't everyday attire for the high priest, and they weren't even annual attire. So the high priest the description of the clothing that he wears in the description in Leviticus of what's worn on the Day of Atonement is not the same stuff that we've been talking about. It's pure linen with a sash, and it probably not the sash that is part of his consecration attire. So I don't know this, but it's possible that you could make a case for Jesus's being in dazzling white, make a connection there between the high priest's clothing on the Day of Atonement, which is a different thing altogether than the stuff I've been talking about.
That's very, very helpful. Well, we are at the end of our session for now. We will take a break and reconvene at 2:55, but let's thank our presenters.